presenter today, Mikołaj Wieniewski, who's assistant professor at the Center for Research on Prejudice and my colleague at the University of Warsaw.
So I'd like to start with talking a little bit about the definitions that I'm going to use and we use in psychology while talking about violence. And I'll talk about two slightly distinct things which we define as an intergroup violence as a proxy to intergroup relations and a collective violence somewhat between, let's say, violence and collective action, something which there is a large body of literature. And the thing which I'm going to focus mostly on is a methodological part. Unfortunately, I'm not going to show you the preliminary results of our work because most of the work is done by historians, and as you all know, most of you are historians, you know that it's taken a while to create the data. We're just recipients, we're taking the information from historians from the project. But I'll show you a small example at the end of how we can use this, this outcome. The intergroup violence, as we define, as we social psychologists are interested in the group processes, is based on a group category. So we distinguish two groups. So this is something that is happening between two group categories, Poles and Jews. However, what is interesting, this is something, if you think about, for example, a hate crime, so this is a big problem for law enforcers, police officers, to distinguish the act that is happening, and it can happen between two people. It can be like sort of assault versus a hate crime. So whether Jacek is beating Moshe because of the argue, or whether Jacek is beating Moshe because Moshe is a Jew. And this can happen between two people. So the importance here is the category, whether both of the participants or a group of the participants in this process are defined by the social categories they represent. From the other hand, the collective violence is partially related to intergroup violence because the categories are very important there, but it's sort of the action which is taken by a group of people. So it implies sort of coordination. Here we talked about the definition of the pogrom and some of the definitions. We have a lot of problems with this definition, but some of the definitions imply that there is a sort of coordination, like state coordination. It's like Francois already said that it's induced by sort of the terror induced by the state, but someone is organizing it. In this concept, we don't really care whether it's a spontaneous erupt of violence, but if it's a spontaneous erupt of violence, it's still coordinated because there is a group of people which is acting in the name of their in-group, their category. Simple perspective, we have two groups. We have a group of, for example, Poles and Jews, or Ukrainians and Jews. This is a broad category. This broad category gives us several aspects that shed a light on the situation in which the violence erupts. First of all, the proportion of those two groups in a place when the violence erupts. This is certain sociological theories relate to this. I'll talk about them a little bit more. So the characteristics of those categories, whether they are very distinct, whether they are similar. This category distinctiveness is a very important aspect in any intergroup relations. So even some theories relate that the threatening of distinctiveness of your own category is a very important factor shaping your aggressive or negative reactions toward the outgroup. If the other group is becoming more similar to your group, and then you cannot distinguish them. The heterogeneity, this continuum of we are very similar one to another, or they are very similar one to another, And those two groups are distinct one from another. And then, of course, in the different places, in the different situations, where we have Orthodox community versus some indigenous people that, Christian people, and then we have communities which are more or less like in Warsaw, when we have mixed communities, and those groups have representatives of a different different aspects. The structural difference between the groups or the categories. So economical, the religious, political differences, or of course very simple, like proportions. And this is very different in different situations, in different acts of violence. We have small cities or small towns when majority of inhabitants are Jewish, and the non-Jewish population is rather small. And then we have cities in which the Jewish population is rather small in comparison to the rest of the groups. The structural aspect of the situation is who is actual group of perpetrators and who is actual group of victims. And we know that not full group category is perpetrating, but certain individuals or groups. And this is defining the act of violence, this specific situation. What might be interesting here in thinking about the violence is the specificity of both direct victims and direct perpetrators. For example, in terms of victims, very interesting work of Tlani and I don't remember the names of the rest of the associates. They've created a data set of victims of lynches in the southern states of the United States. It's a recent thing. What they showed is that the victims of lynches were sort of marginalized people of their own communities, in contrast to their own category. They had smaller families or no families at all. They were poor, so they were more, let's say, vulnerable to the acts of violence. And of course, the question of the perpetrators, who they are, whether they're politically driven, somewhat organized, whether they are instigators in the groups, whether they are they are their own marginalized in the contrast of their own groups, whether in terms of many pogroms or people from the villages around coming to the town when it happens. Then, of course, aspects that are important and also mentioned here, like what is the role of state, whether the state or the officials of the states are mere bystanders, or whether they actively participate in organizing, whether people in uniforms react to the violence and how they react to the violence, whether there is a self-defense from the victims. And of course, the aspect of political instigation. And of course, what is additional aspect already mentioned here, it's going to also be important factor in understanding the event, is the actual trigger event. Whether it's sort of legal gossip or some sort of political manifestation of political ideas. And then, of course, the aspect which is also very variant across the time and across the space is the role of bystanders, because you can understand people not participating in the act of violence as members of the category of perpetrators, but they can come from a different categories, social categories. What is the relations between those categories? Whether it's a majority or minority within the situation. And of course, the bystanders We know it, for example, from studies on bullying or cyberbullying, that bystanders have their moderating role. They can enforce the violence by mere presence. The more inactive bystanders, or even what we call active bystanders, someone who will pass the hammer, right? Someone who will organize, they actually enforce and legitimize the violence in some cases. They, to some extent, also define the violence, mere proportion of bystanders to perpetrators, whether they are active or inactive bystanders. They enforce the size of the mob or the legitimize. And of course, the dynamic within the situation. From the other hand, they have the moderators, so they have some tools, or from the perspective of bystanders who can perceive the aspects that minimize the violence, like protesting or helping behavior. What is interesting, and it's of course a bit different subject, but Barbara Harf in 2002 did her work on genocides. She analyzed several genocides in a quantitative manner, and what she showed that intervention of the third party, even political intervention, has the ability to minimize the violence. So this is all on the side of bystanders. So what we're looking for mechanisms that will explain the how from, for example, on an individual level, how from aggressive thoughts we're going to aggressive violent act, how from differentiating between one group from another comes to a pogrom, and the role of several psychological variables like cognitive aspects, how we perceive, how perpetrators perceive victims, what sort of scripts of actions they have, what sort of cognitive scripts, like I think someone today mentioned it in the discussion after Francois' talk, is that how they knew how to act in this pogrom situation. This can be explained to some extent in what we in social psychology call the script. This is a script of pogrom, or the script of violence. This is how we analyze the emotions, of course. So the role of anger, role of fear, role of actually multiple negative emotions. The role of learning, the role of genes, or many other aspects that we can, to some extent, extrapolate on an intergroup level. Yeah, as I said. And what is interesting, as we think, is that this structural variables that we can observe analyzing history can be linked to those mechanisms, and we can use those theories that we develop and on a more global level to understand what actually happened and how the violence is shaped within this act. Okay, so this is how much time do I have?
7 minutes.
So this is I'll briefly talk about several theories. We are really good in making theories, and we have a lot of those theories in social psychology, not only in social psychology. So I'll briefly pinpoint a couple of them, just to show you the way we can think about the mechanism of shaping violence. One of the very important mechanisms, so the social identity, we can, in an easy way, understand how the group members identify with the category, whether they think in a certain moment that they act as a Polish or Jewish, they act as a Pole. And the thing is, in every collective action, the silence of those categories is very important. So when I'm in my home and when I'm washing my dishes after I ate supper, I'm acting as an individual. But when I'm protesting against changes in, I don't know, in educational law, then I'm acting as a member of the group. And this silence of the category and whether I think that I'm acting in the name of the group is pretty important. And then this process will happen. We have several theories explaining how it happens and what sort of conditions need to be met to enforce this the individuation process. And this process means that whether I'm acting as a group member, I take on values, actions, and thoughts and emotions as a group member. So for example, one of the very interesting work of Adrian Mullen, also on lynching, showed that the level of the individuation depends on how large is the crowd, the mobbing crowd. What he did, he showed, or he compared the pictures, I'm pretty sure pictures from lynching, because the lynch mob was not trespassing. They were doing a lot of pictures with the victims. They were analyzing them on the severity of damage done during the lynching act. And what he discovered is that there is a strong correlation. The bigger the mob, the more severe the act was, which is kind of proving this theories. And then, of course, something which is really important is the ideology, which is translating the how to act in the name of the in-group. Without this ideology is acting as a pole, and what Paul is supposed to do with the Jewish neighbor in a situation. From the other hand, something which is completely opposite, and what is really worth to test is, for example, the theory, the sociological theory of a group or power threat, which the bottom line of it is that the majority group, while the minority group numbers increases, start to feel or perceive the threat from the minority group. So this theory actually assumes that the violence will erupt in the places when suddenly the number of minority or the victims increased, or in the area. Yeah, this is already said. And then, of course, classical theories like realistic group theory, which actually says that the violence is the way or the means for solving conflict or perceived conflict. And then, of course, instrumental motives, so something which already also someone mentioned today, that it can be for individuals or for in-group a way to increase their own potential group status. Classical thinking about the violence, this frustration aggression hypothesis says that needs to be some sort of needs to be frustrated in order to aggressive behavior and aggressive thoughts. And of course, there's a lot of studies on individual level frustration or group level frustration. Then we can complex it a bit more with the role of stereotypes, the perceptions of the in-group and out-group, and how these stereotypes actually translate which group to attack and which group is somewhat responsible for our situation, which goes back, which Peter Blick wrote in his work in 2002, which goes back to a bit more modernized theory of like scapegoat theory that we understand right now. Okay, I'll skip that. What are the biggest problems in studying the violence in preferred setting, the preferred by social psychologists setting? The first of all, the collective violence, as we already showed a couple of pictures, we can understand in a complex manner that it's a complex phenomenon. it's a peak of some sort of process. Itself, it's a process. It's the pogrom erupts. It's have some time dynamics. The waves of pogroms, I know that you don't like the word, but then the waves of pogroms have their own dynamics, showing that the amount of pogroms increases and decreases in different times. The proximity to some Christian holidays and so on. This can be understood as a process itself, but this is a culmination or step in a process, because the outcomes of the pogroms also has a deep impact on the past pogrom intergroup relations and the communities. Okay. What we social psychologists prefer is to take our subjects into laboratory and control all of the alternative explanations in order to test our theories. And within collective violence, no one would like to be a subject, and no ethical comedy would allow for that. So, and this is actually an ethical problem, but this is an empirical problem, because if we cannot do it, we have to use some sort of proxies, and those proxies, like, distributing questionnaires with even the most refined questions are not even close to what a collective violence is in terms of this in-group process, in-group out-group process. So this is a very, very problematic thing. So we can access it only studying a historical events, which we're not trained in. We have absolutely no training in analyzing sources, and of course, the empirical studies. This is a string in numbers, so comparative monographies are a difficult thing, even if you switch from like within our project, right? So we have different eras, different places, different languages. So this is very, very difficult thing to do. And of course, as all historians know, the sources are the biggest problem, because from one time we can have a really nice sources describing credible sources, and from the other time they can be okay. Okay, so what is our goal? Our goal was to create sociological or social psychological model of collective violence that will go beyond just explaining mere violence. How does it happen? Try to generalize what this project allows us, generalize over single events or eras or the historical time. And then what we can do, we can, for example, cross-validate existing theories. All those theories I've listed, and I didn't talk a lot about them, they have, some of them overlap. Some of them are not excluding one another. So in these terms, we could say, for example, which one is better than the other in explaining some aspects of collective violence. Or, of course, what is our main goal is to develop some sort of coherent theory that will unify the explanations. So, as I said, we're not historians, so we make historians do the job and gather data for us. It's happening. It's happening. As you know, it's happening slow, but it's we think the data will be much more credible than whatever we could gather by ourselves. And we designed sort of a questionnaire, and it's a sort of a questionnaire because the questions we are asking are some of them simple, but as I know from historians, they're not so simple to answer. So questions about the proportion of populations before the pogrom. It's questions about the presence of political activists in the city, and changes in the social relations between the before pogrom. And what we're going to do, we're going to predict pogrom severity. Why severity? Because this is a big problem. Already someone mentioned, my memory is very weak. I don't remember if it's the first session. Someone mentioned that it's a problem of distincting the null cases, so the situations in which pogrom didn't occur. And this would be crucial in order to predict what factors lead us to pogrom. Right? Without it, we have to limit ourselves to violent severity, to what factors shapes the outcome of the pogrom, whether the amount of people killed, for example, or the proportions of people killed to population of the city, for example. The problem with reliability of data, this is something that we wash our hands off because we ask historians to do it for us, but also we can include some quantitative measures of it. For example, the amount of sources on certain events. What we can do later on, we can weight our analysis according to each case. If the case is less credible, he will play lesser a role in my, I'm done. Okay, so our new table of pogrom looks more or less like this, and this is a system created. Our historians answer the questions about the event, and what we're going to do, we're going to predict severity, for example, the number of victims to total number of Jewish populations within a town or total populations of the town by certain predictors. Creating a regression equation or logistic regression equation, we can put all of those things that we theoretically think that should end up in a model and take two informations from it. The information is whether the predictor is related to the problem severity and whether it's more or less important within this equation, which of those aspects explains the most of the variance. So to give you a short example, this is the last thing I'm gonna show you. This is something I did. I know that historians will have problems with my data set, but this is data set based on this is a data set based on also historians' work. This is a data set on pogroms in Russian Empire, 1905. It's based on the level of governments. So we have 12 settlements, all those 6 to 15 governments, plus aggregated Poland. Unfortunately, that's how the data was presented by Leo Moskin and then revealed by Shlomo Lambraza in his PhD thesis. So this is the the estimations of number of pogroms and number of victims. And then data from census, 1837, on minority status, which is the percent of partitions among Jewish. Minority threat, which we think that this is a percent of land owned by Jews, so this is this trespassing of the sacred distribution of goods, which were limited only to indigenous populations, and the population threat, or the power threat, which is the percent of Jews in the population. What we can do out of that, we can do regression models. I'll show you 3 of them, actually, which can tell us that, for example, if you want to predict the number of pogroms within a government, this model is actually really weak. However, the best predictor is the percent of land that is owned by Jews in a government. Then if you want to predict the number of victims, then again, Jewish land is the best predictor. The more land Jews own in a government, the more victims. What is actually the most important, most interesting here is that if you try to predict severity of pogrom, right? So the proportion of victims to pogroms, which is a proxy indicator of how severe the pogroms were in the government, you can see that only predicted this one is pretty good, the model is pretty good. The only predictor is the percent of artisans, which it actually tells us that this conflict, like realistic conflict of the categories, actually shows the biggest impact here. And of course, this is not the most sophisticated model, and the data probably not the best. However, this is what sort of possibilities we have within running those models. So, of course, depending on the data set that we'll finally gather, we'll have number of cases, the amount of cases from different eras and from different voivodeships. We can do a descriptive stuff, so diagnosing the severity of pogroms, summarizing and describing it on a more global level. We can explore looking for relations, correlations of different aspects that we embedded in the data sets, and of course we can test those theories that we've mentioned at the beginning.
I have a question about learning. We had a how you investigate the learning curve of violence. One thing I didn't mention because I didn't want to put too much definitions parallel to each other. One thing which appears from the Russian map we did is that where you have places where violence occurs, the reoccurrence of violence is normally more severe. So you have something like it's getting from bad to worse, so to speak. This is true for Balta, this is true for Smela and a number of other places. We didn't study it systematically, but is this something you understand by learning, in the category of learning? Question one. Question two. I didn't hear the word gender. I wonder if in the question of group constitution, gender categories play a role, because in many cases of interethnic violence, gender issues play a massive role. I mean, the whole lynching thing is in most cases you have perceived threat. The perceived threat which leads to the symbolic or to the violence taking place is based on transgression of group boundaries in romantic relationships.
Okay, so answering the first question, the proxy of it is the study I've already mentioned of Barbara Harf. So one of the strongest predictor of genocide in her data set was pure ethnic violence. So this is actually, so this can be understood as learning. In terms of individual violence, learning is the process when you acquire at some point the script that allows you to, or you learn that violence can be a solution to different social situations like conflict. So this is how that's the framework. And yes, definitely I agree with the. I didn't mention about the gender. This is one of the aspects we're looking for. So, for example, which in pogrom violence, I think it plays a significant role, is the not only gender in terms of trespassing certain roles, but then within the victims, you can see that in many of the cases, the victims were females, which is in opposition to what you said about the lynching. And then, of course, it's if we think about the theories talking about violence, collective violence as a mean of social control, so this for sure would be an important factor. The gender and control, they're strongly connected.
Professor David Angel was already presented this morning by Derek Scholar, so I will not review the presentation, and we're really honored to have him.
First of all, I have come across a number of incidents in my years of work as a historian where I've said, here the wisdom of the historian ends and we really need the help of a social psychologist. And now I hear a social psychologist saying that there are points in his research where he says, here my wisdom ends and I really need the help of historians. I don't know how I feel about that. If I should be happy that someone is feeling the same professional discomfort, or if I should despair of the fact that social psychologists really aren't going to help me as I'd always hoped they would. Whatever the case. There's been a lot said here. This is a session whose rubric is methodology, and so I'll concentrate my comments on methodological issues. I said in my own lecture that humanity can be divided into those who see words as their servants and those who see themselves as the servants of words, and I think that we can make that division in the 4 papers that we've seen here. Professor Greenberg's paper, Professor Genet's paper, both did what I would call giving service to the word pogrom. They were concerned with identifying what Professor Greenberg called the true nature of pogroms. They insisted that the word be applied only to incidents that demonstrate what they regard as that true nature. On the other hand, Dr. Kiek and Dr. Wieniewski didn't seem to be as interested in how to apply the word as they were in identifying certain sets of incidents that they think can, when they are analyzed together, tell them something that they want to know. So we might say that the first group of papers tries to define a word, whereas the second group of papers tries to define a category of analysis to which the word that is used as a shorthand symbol for it isn't particularly important. Now, anybody who heard me this morning knows that my own approach is closer to the second than it is to the first. It seems to me that gaining any kind of analytical clarity requires the groups of scholars who are interested in roughly similar sets of problems to be allowed to define categories in a way that's most likely to reveal the answers to one or another question that interests them. And it also requires that those categories be regarded as ad hoc formations. In other words, we can take apart the categories, regroup the elements that make them up as we wish according to the particular problems that we want to solve. Analytical clarity doesn't really require, surprisingly, defining terms independently of the categories that those terms are supposed to create. So, for example, Professor Stola mentioned an article that I published now 16, 17 years ago about violent incidents in Poland after the Second World War in which Jews lost their lives. That was how I defined the category. Didn't give it a name. Simply violent incidents in which Jews lost their lives. Now, that category that I was analyzing included certain events that would fit the definition of a pogrom that Dr. Greenberg gave. But it also included events that Professor Greenberg specifically excluded from that category, like brawls and taverns. Some of the events that I was interested in were attacks by neighbors, Professor Genet's fundamental characteristic of pogroms. Others were attacks by militias, others were attacks by criminals. Now, the reason that I defined my category in that way is that I wanted to know under what circumstances Jews in early post-war Poland were likely to lose their lives. Had I begun from the premise that pogroms and brawls must always be distinguished from one another analytically, then I couldn't have answered my question. I couldn't have done that analysis. Now, I'd say the same thing here about the assertion that the events that took place in the Third Reich on the 9th and the 10th of November cannot usefully be analyzed together with the events that took place in Kiev on the 26th of April, 1881, or in Proskury, Khmelnytsky today, on the 15th and 16th of February 1919, or in Yash at the end of June in 1941. Of course there are differences. Among all four of these events, every historical incident is distinct from every other historical incident in one way or another. But historical incidents also share features with other historical incidents. And whether one concentrates on the differences or on the similarities, and whether concentration on the differences or on the similarities is more productive depends upon the question you're asking and the problem that you want to solve. Here there are enough similarities among any two or three of these four events that I just mentioned to allow them to be divided into fewer than four subsets. Right? We can group them in groups of two or three or four in different ways. For example, in the last three, in Proskurov, in Germany, 1938, in Yash, 1941, we have agencies claiming state authority that were empowering mobs to wield the instruments of violence in pursuit of certain state policy aims rather than using their own instruments of violence directly. Now, if you want to know under what circumstances states are likely to relinquish their monopoly on the means of violence, then it does make sense to consider these three cases together. And if they're to be considered together, there's no absolute and impregnable reason why they shouldn't have the same name. Then it doesn't necessarily have to be pogrom. It can just as well be tuna fish. Right? Or you can make up a nonsense cylinder, or call it XP3 asterisk. Doesn't matter, if you need a label at all. But the way you compose categories, the way you join incidents together, is ad hoc and dependent upon the particular problem you're trying to solve. So, for example, Professor Greenberg has called attention to a set of events that he suggests were a function of the history of the modern nation state as it developed in Central and Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, a development that he calls somewhat retarded compared to developments in the West. Now, that helps direct attention to problems related to the formation of nation states in those parts of the world, and therefore distinguishing certain violent events that happened there from other violent events that happened in other parts of the world or at other times makes sense. But there were events that took place in other parts of the world that have their own histories of interethnic or interreligious violence, but that have a very different history of state formation, that share many features with the history of pogroms, as Professor Greenberg has described them, that could be analyzed productively together with Professor Greenberg's pogroms, if one wanted to ask more generally the kind of questions that Dr. Wieniewski has been asking. Right? I'm not thinking, in addition to the incident that was described by Professor Pakowska this morning in Springfield, but we can talk about violence by whites against blacks in Atlanta in 1906, in Detroit in 1943. We can talk, as I suggested, of violence by Hindus against Muslims in India, in many, many places since the establishment of the Indian state in 1947. And we can go on and on, multiplying these examples. Those are instances that are generally not referred to as pogroms, but it's not impossible that something might be gained by thinking about them as part of the category that includes also the events to which Professor Greenberg gave the name pogrom. Dr. Zaremba asked me before the session began, would I call the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre a pogrom? Well, the question of what I would call it really doesn't bother me. There are certain things that we can learn about intergroup violence, about religious violence, if we think about that event and other similar events that took place during the period of the wars of religion, together with anti-Jewish violence in the 19th and 20th century in Eastern Europe, and Hindu and Muslim violence in contemporary India. And if we want to know things that can be usefully revealed by that comparison, there's absolutely no reason not to include them in the same category. All of this, I suspect, is very difficult to assimilate, because all of us have been brought up on the famous admonition by Voltaire, if you wish to converse with me, define your terms. But it turns out, something that I've learned after many, many years of trying to follow that advice, that it's bad advice for scholars. It's not terms that require definition, it's analytical categories that require definition. Those categories are our own creations, they are ad hoc creations, they don't require names, and they're not dependent on terminology. So I'll stop there for discussion.
Thank you. Now, I would like to welcome all presenters. I can start from the first one. My question is actually more general about the distinction between pogrom and genocide, because Professor Greenberg mentioned at some point that about Armenian pogroms, and some of you, several of you mentioned that what distinguishes genocide from a pogrom is probably the more organized character, that there is a higher level of social organization. I remember a very interesting article by Dariusz Stola about Jedwabne crime, where he wrote, Jedwabne crime cannot be considered a pogrom because of the higher level of social organization, which is typical for genocide. At the same time, we know that in Rwanda we had a genocide with a pretty low level of social organization. And also, Armenian genocide, this is a question. I mean, it's a genocide. We have death marches, we have all the infrastructure of that, so it's high level of social organization. But at the same time, it sometimes has a lot of spontaneous aspects. So, from the very radical point of François, that when talking about 20th century, we shouldn't use the term pogrom in general. I'd like to know, at least for the pogroms that are part of the Nazi genocide, the genocide of Jews in the Nazi era. What do you think is the distinction, if you look like even more broadly, considering Armenian genocide and other forms of genocide, and also pogroms as part of the political mobilization of the National Democratic Movement that was presented by Kamil. When is the pogrom ending, and when the genocidal or ethnic cleansing starts, in your perspective?
Oh, well, it's of course one of the most difficult questions you can ask me, because of the problem. But I will tell you that the same way we can differentiate between pogroms of Jews and genocide of Jews, the same way we can differentiate between individual pogroms of Armenians from genocide of Armenians. Why I use the term because I belong to those who think that we have right to use this word, because many scholars, especially from Israel, would attack me if they had this, what I say here. But I believe yes, there are some very similarities, because there were individual dispositions made by Talat Pasha, by Enver Pasha in 1915 to liquidate. There were different ways of liquidation, because some of groups were took to the desert without food for 15-20 days. It was enough to kill them. Some were liquidated in place. The same situation like in the Second World War. Some were in ghettos, killed, some were because of starving, some were liquidated by SS groups, and so on, so on, so on. So it was, there were some organization behind it, but there were also spontaneous individual cases of doing this. But there is genocide, but there are before and after there were individual cases of pogroms of Armenians, not only in Turkey, in Persia, in Karabakh, and so on and so on. There were very bad relations between people of Georgia or people of Azerbaijan and Armenians. And from time to time there were pogroms. So that is why I don't see a problem here. A problem is rather because I use the discussions made by discussing the words like anti-Semitism, genocide, terrorism, and so on, to this one individual case of term of pogroms. And I'm not always as restrictive as here in this, but I was asked to be restrictive because they wanted me to show the borders of the term after analyzing some individual using of the term. And that is what I tried here to do. It's ad hoc definition. There is no Professor Greenberg's massacre or pogroms. I just tried to do my work. That's all.
If I might, I think what is very important, I mean, following up on Professor Greenberg, I think it is obvious, we have obviously to do with a range of actions which move quite elastically between various forms of inter-ethnic violence or exclusionary violence. And I think we should, when we define, I mean, honoring David Engel's comments, we should try to be, when we as historians look at events, we should be as adequate in the vocabulary we use. We should not look at what happened in a certain place and time as, well, is this a pogrom or not? I mean, if I'm just interested in that, that's not really, I mean, that's not the historian's work. The historian should be interested in what actually happens on the ground, and well, then you can categorize it as a pogrom or not. I mean, or you can have a coffee. Or the point is there are transitions between various forms of exclusionary violence, and I think exclusionary violence is really more and more. I think that the term of exclusionary violence is really the most helpful when we discuss as scholars, when we look at the material, when we look at the records. How this type of violence functions. And nobody in this room or beyond will be able to define which categories and disciplines are to be used or to be excluded in order to understand this violence. It is a violence which is ubiquitous, which has happened all the time, and which will always adapt to its new possibilities. I disagree with you that Rwanda didn't have a high degree of social organization. It was very, very sophisticated in its planning and its execution. Without the Radio des Mille Collines, without the radio, which was systematically send people to specific places to kill, it would not have happened. I mean, you can say that the radio is a low level of social organization. I think it is important to understand that whenever you want to kill somebody, you will find your ways. And obviously, genocides today will probably be based on the internet and identifying people, settlements, and whatever used with satellite images or whatever. I mean, violence goes with the trend and with innovation, unfortunately.
Dr. Mikołaj. So for Kamil, I was wondering what's beyond in your paper. I just wanted to kind of push you against the wall. And is this about inserting the NDEC activists going from the city and bringing their ideology and techniques and strategy to villages? I like very much this playing between the rural and the urban setting, but if you could talk a little bit more about it, and what's the beyond Poles and Jews? Again, I think that when you talked about this new generation of peasants who become, there is this wonderful book on Galicia in this context, but now it's also Congress Poland and everywhere. They become conscious Poles, but the Jews become conscious Poles culturally in a way, and that these.
And cultural Jews
So-
in different way than they were before.
So is this beyond Poles and Jews, as in they all, in a way, are culturally Polish and they clash? If you could just talk some more. And Dr. Mikołaj, I like very much when you talked about the violence as a process, as a possible peak, and then in itself a process and part of a longer process. But I'm trained as historian twice, so maybe that's why. I'm still at loss what this model is supposed to do. What those tables that I could not even begin to understand, what do they really mean? Ultimately, how many people were killed and raped and mutilated or not? It's so contextualized to the pogrom, previous cases of pogrom in this place, the cases of pogrom in the region. And what do we gain from these percentages? Please convert me.
Because my agenda was not very much sophisticated. What I meant beyond Poles and Jews is introduce the terms crucial to all of the historians of the 19th, 20th century. They were not introducing the issues of anti-Jewish violence in Poland, and I think this should be done before we'll try to put in the progress, like to the Procrustean bed, if it was a problem or not. And these times I meant modernization, political modernism, all the process how they divide new divisions among the Polish and Jewish societies, and very much differentiate the social actors who cannot be defined as most books say no, like that there are two
Ethnic groups.
like ethnic groups, and nothing almost important what's happening in between, and the state is the third factor. That was the simplest agenda, and all these big issues that history works in others should be introduced into the topic. Simply.
The difference between the empirical, the quantitative and qualitative is that most of the qualitative stuff is something like you're probably referring to studying a single event in a context of region history, in a context of all the events that led to this specific event. So the same qualitative stuff, qualitative methods goes into digging deep into single event, single case or a group of cases. Quantitative, so something that we propose here is aiming at generalization. So you're of course going to lose a lot of information, contextual information, specific to every single case that we put together. However, it's something like opinion polls. Opinion polls will tell you some distribution of opinions on politics of certain population, but of course will not go into deep every single opinion of every single individual in this population. We're gonna try to do the same. We're gonna go beyond this context. Those tables that I showed, we can understand them as simple correlations of numbers between the 16 categories, the original categories. It's not perfect, but it shows that depending on how you look at it, they are correlated or not. So you know that this percent of Jewish land in the government is related to amount of pogroms and amount of victims, but if you look at the proportion of victims to events, then the percent of artisans start to be important predictors. And of course, if you go deeper into it, you will be able to distinguish those relations with those simplifies indicators. So if we think about the percent of Jewish land owned in a government, that's a very, very crude measure of this, what we say, trespassing of the sacred values, right? This is just a mere number of percent of Jewish owners or Jewish land owned. But on a very general level, it can be attributed to, or the severity of pogrom can be attributed to this. So we're going beyond the. Yeah.
But hopefully we can continue this at the coffee break and then at the next session. Thank you very much for joining.